Welcome to Dental Business RX. Practice success in 30 minutes or less.
Thank you for calling ABC Dental.
I'm going to start off this week's episode with a question. Do you own a dental practice? And if you answered yes to that question, here's a follow-up question. What is your overhead? Now, how would you answer this question? Would it be with, I don't know, or I have to ask my accountant? Or would you have some idea, maybe an amount or a percentage? And if you're able to give me a number or percentage, how accurate would it be? Full disclosure, what inspired this week's episode was a conversation I had recently with Sabri. Many of you know her from, guesting on episodes of the podcast. She's our Deputy Chief Operating Officer here and in charge of all of our technical delivery. Anyway, she ran through a string of brand new clients, first time to MGE, who had no clue what their overhead was. And to set the scene, when interviewing a new client, just like you do with a new patient, we find out what their chief complaint is amongst doing the normal things we do to find out about their practice. Just like you do with a new patient, you do your normal diagnostics, etc. You're going for the full picture. Well, to a person, the chief complaint from every one of these clients had to do with profitability or lack thereof. They didn't feel like they had enough money, etc. So then, as you'd expect, as she's drilling down on this, she asks the question, which she asks every new client, which is, what's your overhead? And there's where the anomaly set in. As I mentioned earlier, not one of them had any idea. Their answers were, I'd have to check with my accountant, or I don't know, etc. She was shocked. So I started hunting around a bit with some of our other technical personnel who'd be meeting with a brand new client and got more of the same. Most of the newer clients they talked to had no clue what their overhead was. Sure, some of them had an idea, but none of them could really attest to the accuracy of it. If anything, this was also a bit of a shock for me. Having done this for some time, I'd estimate that, back in the late 1990s, if I asked a dentist this question, 60 to 70% of them would have been able to give me some form of an answer. It might not have been right, but they would have had an idea about somewhat, maybe not confidently, what it was. So something has definitely changed, and it's not a good change. We have more and more doctors, or should I say business owners, that are completely unaware of what it actually costs to operate their practice or business. And I can't stress this enough. This is something as a business owner that you must know and control. This is not optional. This isn't something that you can outsource like filing insurance claims, okay? And adding fuel to this fire, you're operating in a highly inflationary environment for the past 4 years. So you must be on top of this and in control. And that's what I want to talk about in this week's episode. We're going to dive into this overhead subject a bit and really confront what's involved with coming up with and maintaining an accurate overhead figure for your practice. My name is Jeff Blumberg, and I'm your host. And let me start by qualifying my last statement, specifically about the importance of controlling your overhead and that it's something that you must do. You don't have to do this. You could ignore it, outsource it, wait for your accountant to give you a P&L a month after the fact if you don't care about overspending, wasting money, or nuking your profitability. Sure, you could just not bother. But I'm guessing that you do care about your profitability and things of that nature. So yes, this is a must-do. And I also understand that when you're dealing with overhead or numbers, it's not the sexiest thing to look at. It's sometimes difficult to confront or deal with. It can get very stale or boring. You might feel like you're not a numbers person, doing quotation fingers. And it's probably not why you got into business. But but you're a business owner. So this is one of those things with whether you like it or not, you have to do this. Just like if you own a practice, you have to be skilled as an executive. Whether you like it or not, you own a business. It's an inevitable fact. If you really can't stomach the idea of being an executive or controlling your expenses or things like this, then maybe you shouldn't own a business. And here's the deal, is you could definitely learn how to do this. There's really no reason to not own the business and learn these things. It's something that's not very difficult to overcome and understand, okay? But you're going to either control it or it's going to control you. So I would suggest that you'd prefer to control it. So, that's what I would suggest that's what I would hope that you would do. So if you're up to the point where you go, look, I really want to deal with this. I really want to understand it. I want to know what it costs to run my business, right? First off, I applaud you. And I know that sometimes it takes a tough time digging into this. So what I intend to do in this episode is I'm going to go over some of the basics on this. You could actually use this episode, to figure out your overhead. All right. The way we're going to do it is the first thing you'd got to do, and I know this is kind of tough on a podcast, but on the episode webpage, I have, or wherever you're listening to this, whether it's Apple or Spotify, this link will be on there. The first thing you have to do is download the overhead sheet. This is a spreadsheet that you download and you can use to calculate your overhead. I'm going to go over how to use this sheet, and I'm going to cover some of the biggest mistakes people make when they use it so that you can actually come up with an accurate figure. Now, this is a podcast. Keep in mind, this is not a 2-hour video. So to that end, if you want a little bit more assistance with this, here's what I'd suggest that you do. This is my shameless plug of the episode. On DDS Success, our online platform, it's ddssuccess.com. I'll put a link to it on the episode webpage. We do have a finance series of courses. There's 2 courses up there now as of this recording. There's 4. There's 2 that are currently in editing. In this series of courses, these are courses that I put on, I specifically walk you through how to set yourself up financially. The first course is how to accurately calculate your overhead, and I literally walk you through every single step. So if you want to check that out, I'm going to give any of our listeners listening today, I can give you a special code you can use to get a discount on DDS Success. It's MGE269. The normal price for the subscription is $289 a month. This is $269 a month. You can save $20 a month. And it's a subscription-based platform. There's no contract, nothing. And it's not just this. This is just one of the courses on there. There's actually a ton of training for your team on various positions in the practice, reception, scheduling, treatment coordinator, etc., as well as a lot of sales training for the doctor and basic organizational training that I do with Sabri. We call it our Jumpstart. So I definitely advise that you check it out if you really want assistance on putting this together. In any event, so let's take a look at how we're going to start putting your overhead together. So the first thing you got to do is download the spreadsheet, because I'm going to start explaining this a little bit, and it's still worth listening to if you don't have it in front of you. I'm going to kind of go over the basics here. So if you take the overhead sheet and you look at it, it breaks down into 2 parts. There's a worksheet and a summary sheet. The worksheet is where you list out all of your expenses, and then the summary sheet totals them all for you. And it's broken down into 25 different categories. All right. So like, for instance, the first category is property, rent, and mortgage expenses. Okay. And you enter the figures in there, and then it shows up on the summary sheet and gives you a number as to what your monthly overhead is. So that's the first thing. Okay. And this is a monthly overhead. This is a monthly overhead sheet. All right. So the expenses we're putting on here are monthly. So that would mean any expenses that are not monthly, you're going to have to convert to monthly. This is not very difficult. But to do that, you're going to need to know a little bit of math here, and it's not very complex. But let me throw out the first one. Let's say you have a weekly, or let's say you have a weekly expense. Maybe you only pay payroll every other week, but from an employee's perspective, and actually from reality, they're earning pay every day or at least every week. So payroll is sort of a weekly expense, even though you may only be dispersing it once every other week. So how do you turn a weekly expense into a proper monthly expense? Well, let's look at what the common way people do it, because it's actually incorrect. If you pay an employee $1,000 a week, how much do you pay them a month? Now, most people will answer that question, well, I pay them $4,000 a month because there's 4 weeks in a month. That's not absolutely correct. It's actually slightly, a little bit, mostly, it adds up. It's incorrect because there are actually 52 weeks in a year. If there were only 4 weeks every month and 12 months a year, we would have 48 weeks a year, but we have 52. It's actually 4.2 something weeks per month on average. So how do I take that weekly expense and turn it into a monthly expense? The simplest way to do it is, let's say I've got this employee, I'm paying $1,000 a week. I multiply it by 52 weeks a year, because that's how many weeks are in the year, and generally employees like to be paid for every week. And then I divide that by 12 months. So 1,000 multiplied by 52, which is 52,000 a year, divided by 12 months is actually $4,333.33 per month. You might go, well, that's not a huge difference between 4,000 versus 433.33, but it is when you start adding it up with a bunch of other employees. It's actually almost 10%. So you do this with weekly expenses. If you have a semi-monthly expense, expense you're paying twice a month, you would just simply, take those two expenses and that becomes your monthly expense. Maybe you have a bi-monthly expense. And this is where things start to get tricky. Bi-monthly, quarterly, or yearly expenses. Let's say you're paying, an expense every other month. Well, you're only paying it when you have to pay it. So you're not thinking about it the month that you're not paying it. But if I'm paying an expense every 2 months, and let's say it's $1,000, that works out to $500 a month. If I'm paying $3,000 a quarter for something, let's say it's some type of insurance, that works out to, because a quarter is 3 months, really $1,000 a month. And then you see cases where someone's paying, $24,000 a year in taxes, and it's one month a year they're paying that $24,000. Well, theoretically, if you were to extrapolate over the course of a year, $24,000 divided by 12 is $2,000 a month. This is how you keep yourself in a situation where you don't end up with no money when you have a large bill due. So ultimately what we want to do with this monthly overhead sheet is we want to take all of our expenses and convert them to monthly. So what are all of our expenses? Now, again, it doesn't translate great to a podcast. That's why you should watch the video. Anyway, again, shameless plug. But here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to go over the basic categories that we have on our overhead sheet. And again, I suggest you download it just to kind of give you an overview of what they are. There's 25 of them. What are the categories? There's rent and mortgage expense, lease expenses, loans and lines of credit, credit card expenses, insurance coverages, outside services, utilities, phones, dues, licensing, subscriptions, and recurring payments. This is a big deal now. This is, and I should mention, I mentioned it earlier, if you've downloaded our overhead sheet, let's say 2-3 years ago, this is a new overhead sheet that's been modified to fit the way things work now. But like, for instance, subscription and recurring payments, if you look at it, a lot of the services that you're using are subscription or recurring payment. If you're using any type of a phone service, maybe where it's voice over the internet, like a Weave or an Addit or something like this, or you've got a Casey subscription. I mean, even software is done on a subscription basis. If you have Microsoft Office for your employees, you're probably paying $99 a year per employee. It used to be you'd go out and buy Microsoft Word. You remember the boxes back in the day for those older folk like me, and you'd, install it on your computer. Well, you don't do that anymore. Now it's all subscription based. It's recurrent revenue based. So this is an important point you want to list on your overhead sheet. Then there's staff payroll, associate payroll, owner doctor payroll. Yes, you should get paid. Pension and retirement plans, advertising, PR and promotions, continuing ed, office expenses, business-related taxes if you have any of those, medical, dental supplies, lab expenses. And we broke lab into two sections. There's basic lab, and then there's clear aligner lab expenses. There's a reason I did this. I go over it in the course. But essentially, not that I hate clear aligners. They're great. I actually did clear aligners myself. That isn't the point. But what happens is when you get these practices, because it's a quick hit, right, to sell an Invisalign or a ClearCorrect or whatever case, it's a quick hit. And it's $5,000 that appears on your day sheet as for production. It's great. But most people aren't necessarily associating that with the $1,800 lab fee or whatever you might be paying, depending on your level of participation with that company. If you took the similar amount of production in doing, let's say, crowns, your lab fee is not going to be anywhere near as high. So I'm not saying that people shouldn't do clear aligners. I'm not in any way infringing on your relationship with your patients as a doctor. But the point I'm making is I've seen practices that go super heavy on them and then ignore the other types of treatments or aren't as excited about, they don't promote them as much, the other types of treatment. And then you end up with these ton of clear aligner production cases, and they're not thinking with the lab fee that's going to come due. So it's something that you definitely want to monitor, and it can catch up with you if you don't. Last two categories are back bills, and then we have a category called other expenses in case any expenses were missed on the overhead sheet. The one thing I will tell you is our overhead sheet was born out of years and years and years of looking at overhead sheets and research and stuff like this. And I first took a dive into this back in, we're talking a while back in the 90s, because I would talk to doctors and ask them what their overhead was. They would tell me 40, and then I'd sit down and I'd figure it out, and it was really 50 because they were miscalculating payroll or this or that or whatever, or they weren't thinking with quarterly or annual expenses. So it's important to know what your overhead is because it's part of the profit formula, right? Without getting into all the specifics about profitability, I mean, if you look, what is profit? It's how much you make less what you spend. So if you want to increase your profit, you have to increase the amount you make or reduce the amount you're spending, or both. So if you have no control over either of those, your profit just sort of blows in the wind and you have you can't do anything about it. Obviously, you want to be able to control your profitability, so it's important to know how much you are spending. All right, so what are the biggest mistakes I see when people fill out this overhead sheet? Because you've got this spreadsheet, you want to sit down, you've psyched yourself up a bit, you're ready to fill this thing out. What are the biggest mistakes I see? Well, there's a few categories where people make mistakes, and I want to clarify. There's two types of mistakes that I'm referring to here. The first, and the one I'm going to mainly be focusing on in this episode, are the mistakes that people make when they're filling the sheet out, where they just do it incorrectly and they come up with an incorrect number. That's what I'm going to focus on. The other mistake you can make with relation to overhead is spending too much or too little in a category. For instance, someone spending nothing on marketing and wondering why they're getting new patients. Well, that's just a mistake, right? Or, a person goes out and buys all types of equipment that they don't really need yet clinically. The person's doing 1 or 2 implants a month and they go out and buy a cone beam. They don't really need one yet, but they go out and buy it because, it's cool and it's high tech and whatever. And the amount if they were to outsource those cone beams, which there's numerous ways to do this, they'd be better off because the revenue they're making from the cone beam doesn't even cover the cone beam payment. That's a mistake, and I've talked about that in other episodes. I'm not going to focus on those mistakes so much, like where people screw this up, maybe a little bit, but I'm mainly going to focus on where you end up with inaccuracies on the overhead sheet so that you can come up with an accurate overhead sheet. Like I said, again, if you want me to walk you through this, check out that course. Last time I'll say it, maybe one more time later as we get in the episode. All right, so what are the biggest categories where I see mistakes on here? First category has to do with rent and mortgage expense. It's actually category number 1 on the overhead sheet. Now, why do people mess this up? Well, it's actually pretty simple. If you look at the blanks you can fill in on the sheet under property rent and mortgage expense, there's property rent, primary mortgage, secondary mortgage, leasehold improvements, association dues, or real estate taxes. The reason there's all these blanks is because I needed a sheet that encompassed most people's situations, okay? So you might have somebody whose lease requires that they pay real estate taxes, and someone else may have a lease where that's just included in their rent, okay? It really depends. But in any event, where people mess this up is, let's say you own your own building. So you own your building and you pay yourself rent. That's how things are set up. So what number should end up on this overhead and expense worksheet? Well, the number that should end up on this overhead and expense worksheet is your monthly rent, not your mortgage expense. If you own your building, and I've only seen this twice in my career where the practice itself owns the building. The majority of times when somebody owns their own building, the doctor owns the building through a separate LLC or something like this. And then they also own the practice, and the practice is a tenant of the building. All right, so we're doing the practice's overhead right now. So the practice does not pay the mortgage. The building LLC pays the mortgage out of the proceeds from the practice's rent. So the only number that should be on here then is what your monthly rent is, as well as any other expenses associated with rent. Maybe the lease you signed with yourself included that you had to pay real estate taxes, or it included something about the build-out loan or something. Who knows, right? Or you have association dues, and that's included in your lease. If that's a practice expense, that's what ends up on here. What I see happens is I'll see people list the mortgage that they're paying on the building plus the rent. They're double counting, in other words. So you don't want to do that, all right? Next area where I see this goes wrong has to do with loans, and leases are usually pretty easy, but loans and lines of credit. So under loans, I'm going to list out what my monthly loan payment is. Now, you might be in a situation where you're newer in practice and you have a graduated loan payment, meaning that the bank gives you a break early in the loan because you're just starting out, and then that number is supposed to go up as time goes on, and then it maybe matures anywhere from 7 to 10 years. You would just list the payment as it is now. Obviously, as that payment goes up, you would adjust your overhead sheet, which I'll talk a little bit about before the end of the episode. But let's talk about lines of credit for a minute. If you have a line of credit, depending on the credit line, because all credit lines are different, you're most likely, you might only be required to service the interest on the credit line, meaning, you have a credit line and the interest payment every month is $200, but you have $100,000 outstanding on the credit line. I mean, now with today's interest rates, it would be higher. I'm talking from a few years ago there, but you get the general idea. Maybe it's $500, whatever that might be. But that's all you're required to pay, but you're not retiring that $100,000 in principal that you have. Well, a lot of lines of credit come with some form of an expiration or a conversion, meaning that at some point you're going to have to renew the line, or you're going to have to, the line becomes a loan at that point, or something of that nature. Okay, so I would find out about that if you have a line of credit, what the terms are associated with it. Let's say I have a line of credit and in 3 years from now, I have to put in for renewal. Well, if that bank gets into trouble and I have $100,000 outstanding on this line of credit, I go to renew, or maybe I get into trouble. I go to renew this line 3 years from now, and the bank says, no, you can't renew the line. Give us our $100,000. Well, I don't want to find myself in that situation. So what I would most likely do if you have a line of credit with an outstanding balance under this section is I would figure out when is the expiration or renewal date, and how much would you have to pay every month? You can use like an Excel loan calculator to do this, or you could ask your accountant to do this for you. How much would I have to pay every month to have that down to zero by the time that renewal comes due? Okay, or when you're going to have to go talk to the bank again. And that's the number I would put on here. I would just bake that into my overhead because, why not? I should pay the line of credit off anyway. All right. Then the next section that gets misunderstood very often is the section credit cards, which is number 4. So you'll notice in here, and it's very difficult to read, it's very small, but it says note. If you're carrying a balance on your office credit card, list the minimum payments below. You might go, why in the world would I list minimum payments? I'll get back to you on that in a second. Let's read the next section. If you use the credit cards for other expenses detailed in this worksheet and pay it off at the end of each month, list the expenses in the other sections provided and do not include them here. So let's say I'm using a Visa for dental supplies, right? I'm working with DC Dental or Shine or Patterson or whomever, and they just charge my card, and at the end of the month, I pay the card off in full. That's really a dental supply expense. I'm using my credit card as a means to pay that versus using a check or an auto debit out of my checking account, but it's not credit card debt. Do you see? Unless I leave a balance on the card. So I would list that expense under dental supplies. Or let's say for lab, I would list that under lab. This section specifically is if you are carrying credit card debt for any reason that you're servicing with interest or whatever. Doesn't matter the reason. Maybe you bought a piece of equipment. Maybe you did some office travel and couldn't pay it off at the end of the month. Doesn't matter, okay? It's whatever credit card debt you are carrying would get listed under this section. But then what payment should you list? Now, without getting into a huge explanation on this, why would we ask somebody to put minimum payments here? Well, number one, because if the minimum payment is there, you're at least servicing your debt. But we know that the long-term solution is not to pay minimum payments. If you get your credit card statement, it says right on there what's going to happen to you if you do. Your $30,000 balance is going to be $150 million. It's a lot, right? Especially with credit card interest rates today. But we list the minimum payments through the system that we teach our clients to actually increase profitability. What they end up doing then is accumulating profit, right? And of course, accounting for taxes associated with the profit. And then they just pay the credit cards off in full, and then they end up carrying no credit card debt. But you do this just to make sure that you're meeting your monthly nut, so to speak. But this is an area that causes confusion, so I figured I would cover it. Next area is outside services, which is category number 6. And, the one before it, I'm only covering the categories where I see mistakes made. The one before it is insurance. Most people, list their insurance bills out. But keep in mind with insurances, some of those bills are quarterly, so make sure you do this so it's monthly. But there's not a lot of mistakes I see made there, like with utilities and stuff. So I'm not going to talk about those. Outside services are things like your accountant, your lawyer, and HR service, things of that nature. Well, the problem with these is in a lot of cases, you're not spending this money routinely. And, a lawyer might cost you X amount one year and then more the next and then less the year after that. It really depends on how often you have to use them. So what I would do is just get an average, right? You probably have some type of a regular amount you're paying an accountant, depending on your degree of utilization and the accountant that you're using. Take whatever you paid them last year and the year before. If they're similar amounts, just divide it by 12, and that becomes your monthly figure that you put on this sheet, okay? And things under outside services also include practice management, software support and training, your answering service, things of that nature. But it's an area I see mistakes get made because people don't account for it. Next area where I see mistakes made, again, I'm skipping the ones where I don't see mistakes made, but I will put your attention, obviously not skipping them all, to category number 11, which is subscriptions and recurring payments. This is the one where, these are things we don't think about. This is like, who was I talking to? Somebody recently. And I was comparing the average young person's experience today to my experience when my wife and I first got married. We're in our early 20s and we're married. And, what were my monthly expenses? There wasn't a cell phone. There was a house phone. You paid a little bit extra if you wanted the push button phone instead of the rotary phone, which my kids look at and go, what is that thing? They've seen it in a movie, right? So you had a house phone. You had maybe cable, you had rent, and you had food, and you had your car payment or whatever. You didn't have Netflix and Amazon Prime and an iPhone and all these different crazy expenses that are just monthly expenses that you don't think about. And most of these get converted over to a credit card, so you don't see them, and you just see the credit card balance, right? So I'm not saying you shouldn't have these things, but you should at least account for them because they can add up real quick if you're not paying attention to them, okay? That's what's important. So category 12, this is the area people have trouble with, staff payroll. So a couple things on this. So the first thing was what I had mentioned earlier, converting a weekly pay amount to a monthly pay amount. You want to make sure that you do that properly so you account for the full amount that you're having to allocate for payroll. The other thing is, if you want to figure out what your average payroll is, this is a little bit more confusing for people these days because most people use some form of a payroll service. So let me paint this picture for you. Let's say your payroll is $20,000 a month for your team. Okay, so you get the ADP report and you look at it, and it will tell you that payroll was $14,000 for the checks that went to employees that were direct deposited in their account and $6,000 in payroll taxes. Okay. So people look at this and they can't quite figure out, how much am I actually paying somebody? Well, the reason for that is a lot of that $6,000 in my example of payroll taxes was the taxes that employees were paying as a part of their pay. When you give an employee a paycheck, several things are withheld depending on where you practice. But let's say in the United States, your state tax being withheld if you have state tax, which we don't have in Florida, which is cool. Your federal withholding, your income tax is withheld. And your Social Security and Medicare, which is called FICA. You've probably heard that acronym before. I think it stands for the Federal Insurance Contribution Act. I love how they use the word. You ever notice that with some of these bills or laws? They're named with like a kind of a nice phrase. The Federal Insurance Contribution Act. Like I always think of contribution where I'm putting money in the Salvation Army kettle or something like this. Not something that I have to give or, I'm going to end up in debt or going to jail, right? But anyway, beside the point. So you're paying, I have an employee, they make $1,000 a week. Well, what they're receiving in their bank account when all is said and done is whatever that might be, $700 or $800. What happened to the $200? Well, some of it was the taxes that they are projected to owe. Some of that is for the federal government. Some of that's state tax. And then 7.62% of it is FICA, which is 6.2% of that is Social Security and 1.45% of that is Medicare. Okay. Now, I, as the employer, have to match their FICA. So they paid $76.20 in FICA. I have to also pay on top of the $1,000 I'm paying them, $76.20 in FICA. I hope this didn't just bore you to death, but these are things that I want to be aware of. So what I do when I sit down with a client to do their payroll, I don't pull the ADP reports out. I mean, I do it just to see utilization. If they have an assistant, they're paying that assistant $25 an hour, and we're trying to figure out what this assistant's pay is. I want to look at how many hours a week they're working. That I might use the ADP report for. But what I'm going to do is go, okay, we're paying them $25 an hour. They work 40 hours a week, so their average pay is $1,000 a week. And then I'm going to do my monthly calculation based off of that. That's how I'm going to figure out what I'm paying people. Now, because I'm withholding taxes or whatever, that's why if you use the ADP stuff, you can end up getting confused, but I would use it to refer to hours or to at least look at what someone's gross salary is. But this is where people mess this up. And, I was leery about doing this in a podcast because it takes me a few minutes to explain this when I do the finance seminar. But if you look at the payroll section, it lists out all the potential positions in your practice and how much you're paying them. And then that's section 12. But then section 12A is staff payroll-related taxes, and it has company FICA, which I just explained. And again, look, I'm not an accountant or a tax attorney. I definitely advise that you have those on your team, and you can refer to them. I'm not giving you accounting advice or tax advice or anything of that nature. There's my disclaimer. But it has company FICA. Now, as I just mentioned, that should be about 7.62% of your payroll. But I've had people go, my payroll is $20,000 and my taxes are $6,000. That's impossible to have that as payroll taxes, because if it's $20,000 and your FICA, which is usually going to be your largest payroll related expense, is 7.62%, your FICA is going to be like $1,500. So you'd list out gross pay under section 12, and then you'd list under 12A what these other taxes are using those calculations. Again, you can ask your accountant about this if you have questions, right? Because the only taxes these are the taxes, in other words, that you are going to be paying on top of the employee's payroll. Okay? Important to know. So that's another area where mistakes get made. And people then think that their total payroll expense is $26,000 instead of $22,000, and it misestimates their overhead. Okay, next area where I see mistakes get made is, and this is one of those mistakes where it's just done incorrectly. If I'm trying to figure out my overhead and I own a business, I have to factor in, what do I need to make in order to work in this business? I don't want to own a business and work in the business and go have to get an associate gig so that I can pay my bills at home, unless it's a starter practice. If I've got an established practice, I shouldn't have to do that. So the practice, if I'm really calculating the overhead correctly, should pay me enough in order to live. Well, I have under this section 14, is owner-doctor compensation. Now, where do I see mistakes made here? Well, the owner-doctor needs, let's say, $10,000 a month to be able to properly manage their household, okay? Pay their bills, fund their pension, whatever it is that they've got going on at the house. They need at least $10,000 a month, or maybe it's $20,000 a month, whatever that number is, okay? But they pay themselves sort of a symbolic salary of $5,000 a month, but they need $10,000. So they list $5,000 on this overhead sheet, because that's what their paycheck says, under owner-doctor compensation, but they need more money than that. And the reason why this is a problem is you're supposed to use this overhead sheet. Once it's all calculated and everything's said and done, you use this overhead sheet for a number of things. 2 years ago, I did an episode on calculating a bonus system for your practice. Well, if I don't know what my overhead is, how am I going to accurately calculate what a bonus should be? For instance, if my basic overhead is $80,000 a month, well, I'm probably not going to pay any bonuses unless we collect at least $100,000, because I need to be paying off debt and storing profit and things of that nature. But if I don't know what my overhead is, I'm going to set my bonus system incorrectly. So included in that overhead should be what you need to make in order to survive, because why would I want to be paying bonus if I can't pay my bills at home? So it's not so much an administrative mistake that I see here, but it's more of just a philosophical mistake when people are doing their overhead. They don't figure this out, and then they end up not paying themselves enough, or they're paying bonus when they haven't made enough in order to live. Okay, next category on this sheet, which is problematic, it's actually the last one I'm going to discuss, has to do with advertising. So if you go to number 16, that's advertising. So under advertising, we have everything listed: website design, website hosting and maintenance, search engine optimization, Google ads, etc. So where people get confused on advertising, especially with digital advertising, I mean, with a postcard, it's pretty easy to think with, but it's very similar. If I print a postcard and I want to mail it out to prospective patients in my area, there are going to be 4 expenses associated with that. Number 1, what I paid somebody to design that postcard. Number 2, what I paid somebody to print that postcard. Number 3 is the cost per piece to prep that thing to mail, printing addresses on it or bundling it if I'm doing like every door direct mail. And number 4 is the postage associated with the postcard. Those are the expenses. So the similar thing holds with digital advertising. I may be paying somebody to manage my Google ads or my Facebook ads, but then I have to pay Google or Facebook to place those ads. We call that your ad spend, okay? So I have people fill this out and they don't put their ad spend on there, and we come up with their advertising number and it's, $4,000, but they're actually spending another $3,000 or $4,000 on ad spend, so their expense is really $8,000. Do you see? So you want to account for your ad spend when you're figuring out your marketing budget, and it has it right here under, search engine optimization. Then you have Google ad management and ad spend, Facebook ad management and ad spend, etc., or implant funnel management and spend. Because again, I might be paying something for the management and I'd be paying something for the spend. Okay? So those are the main areas where people tend to make mistakes when filling out this overhead sheet. So what would I do if I were you? Well, you have to know your overhead. So I would sit down, I'd pull it up, I'd have my QuickBooks or whatever expenses I have nearby, a lot of this stuff. And, I've said this before. I think I've said it before on the podcast. I could sit down with any client and probably figure out their overhead within 1 or 2% without them having nothing near them. If I were to ask you what your rent is, you probably know. Okay. You could at least give me a general idea. Maybe the cents would be off, or you'd say it's 5,500 and it's really 5,479. We'd be pretty close. So you have a generalized idea of what you spend. So you sit down, you confront every category and you fill it in. Okay. And you get it all populated. Then you get a realistic number as to what it costs to actually run your business. And in most cases, when people do this, it's a lot higher than you thought it was going to be. Okay. You've been operating off of, bad data, or you don't know exactly what it costs to run your practice. And once you can confront that and you see that, you can go a couple of different directions. Okay. You can start cutting expenses a bit, especially expenses that don't necessarily contribute to, patient care or making more income. Or you can figure out a way to increase your income, because those are the 2 things that you need to toggle in order to make more money. Now, how often would you monitor your overhead? Like I mentioned, we are in an inflationary environment, even though the monthly amount is going down. It just means, probably the best example I saw or that I would give is, if inflation goes down to 3% year over year, meaning things are 3% more this year than they were at this time last year, all that means is that the inflation is going up less fast. So if it was at 10%, it's going up fast. If it's 3%, it's still going up. It's just going up less fast. It's not going down. Things aren't becoming cheaper. Okay. So you want to stay on top of your overhead consistently. So what would I be doing? I'd probably, anytime I added a new expense of any kind, if I added a new piece of equipment or I had a new employee, I would adjust my overhead sheet. If I've added no new expenses, I would probably be checking on it at least quarterly. And how would you check on it? If you're estimating a certain amount for a utility bill, then you would, check has the utility bill actually been, right? Or what you estimated your payroll. And obviously your payroll you should be able to or control to some degree, but if you added a new employee, that number would go up. But these are things that you want to stay on top of, because if you don't, your overhead can run out of control very quickly. And like I said, if you want to have somebody sit down with you, or at least virtually to a degree sit down with you and do it, you can check out that course, how to properly calculate your overhead. You can use the discount code, that the MGE 269, to make sure that you can get a little discount on it as you do it. So yeah, kind of a strange episode. I wanted to put it out because I thought it was very important, and I wanted to make sure that you at least knew you got to know what your overhead is. This isn't something you're going to handle next month, next year, whatever. It's something that you got to know now if you want to control the future of your business. You can't really do that if you don't know how much it costs in order to run it. I hope this helps. Don't forget, download the overhead sheet, because you're going to need it if you want to follow along with some of this stuff. And if you have any questions about MGE, you can find us online at mgeonline.com or call us at 800-640-1140. Folks, have a great week, and we'll see you at the next episode.